Is our health system ready for where science is taking us? To lead us through today's discussion, you will all be familiar with this well-known Canadian medical and health journalist. Without further delay, Avis Favreau. Avis, all yours.
Thank you very much, Matt, and hello to everyone across the country. Thank you for joining us. And the way we're going to phrase this is that we're talking about the dawn of living medicines. When I started my health journalism career many years ago, like 40, this was talked about, but it's actually at the doorstep. And I've started doing stories on it, and it's fascinating and it's so interesting. So this session really is, how do doctors and health systems and hospitals and provinces start to deal with these new therapies, because they're coming? These are not pills and medications in the traditional sense. This is a new kind of thinking because we're talking about cell-based therapies, plural. And there's two particular kind that you're going to be hearing about today. One is the ones that fix defective or missing genes, and those are for diseases like thalassemia and sickle cell anemia. And then there are the cell therapies, and those are engineered. They take the cells from the patient, tweak them, reprogram them, put them back in the patient so that they then target the disease or cancer. And the one you'll be hearing about today is something called CAR T. Now, you'll learn that term today. So I found out that there are some 27 gene and cell-based therapies approved in the US and in Europe. I think there are about 12 in Canada. But what's important is that there are some 2,000 more being worked on in labs around the world. And just a couple of weeks ago, the New England Journal published a very exciting study. There's a lot of talk of it online, that showed that one cell therapy called CAR T therapy was possibly promising in autoimmune diseases like lupus. That is a huge new area. And so what do we do with this? How do you prepare? Because these therapies will be different. It could be that just a single one-time treatment could replace the burden of illness and all the healthcare costs for some of these diseases. So we are joined today by 4 experts in different fields to talk about these emerging tools, and you're going to learn a lot. From Calgary, we'll be joined by Dean Duffin, father and a cancer care advocate. Dean hasn't joined us yet, but we know he'll show up. From Toronto, Dr. Elise Ayon, a researcher and physician from the Department of Ophthalmology and Vision Sciences at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, and an expert on gene therapy and their use in retinal eye diseases. Hi, Dr. Ayon.
Hi, thank you.
From Hamilton, Dr. Ronan Foley, a clinical hematologist at the Juravinski Cancer Center, who treats patients with blood cancers with those CAR T therapies you'll be hearing about. Hi, Dr. Foley. And from Toronto, Dr. Bob Bell, former Ontario Deputy Minister of Health and Long-Term Care, and the former president and CEO of University Health Network, who's going to talk about the big picture of how do you introduce these brand new therapies, some of them with eye-watering price tags, like $2 million per patient, but with potential life-sparing benefits. So we'll be talking about effectiveness, availability across the country, and what frontline doctors are seeing as they start using these therapies, along with some tips for how to move this along more quickly, because there will be a demand. So we're going to, since Dean hasn't joined us yet, we're going to go to Dr. Ayon at the Hospital for Sick Children. We met a few years ago doing a story on gene therapy for retinal eye diseases. And at that point, it was so exciting.
It wasn't approved,
It wasn't approved. So tell me now how the cell therapies for eye diseases are changing the way you practice.
Thank you, Avis. So cell therapies currently are not integrated in our practice, but are studied extensively. And cell therapies, unlike the CAR T that Dr. Foley is going to talk about, for us is to replace a tissue. Like a lot of people hear about the stem cell therapy, where we can manipulate the cells to become, for example, a retina-specific cells to replace a missing piece of retina where there's a scar, for example, like macular degeneration. The challenge with the cell therapy for us is the integration of the cell in the rest of the tissue. But it's progressing very fast. It's progressing very fast.
Are you
Sorry.
Are you starting to use it in patients in an experimental way?
Not us at Sick Kids, and it's tested in some clinical trials, mostly for older patients, for macular degeneration. But it's evolving quickly. It's evolving quickly. There's been no adverse event, which is great. The only challenge is the retina is like a microchip, and the challenge is the neural reconnections, and so that's what people are working on. So it's only at the very early clinical trial level.
All right. So what kind of diseases that people would be listening to would these apply to? Macular degeneration? What other ones?
Yeah, any condition, for example, advanced retinitis pigmentosa, where the retina has died mostly. So anywhere where there's a loss of tissue. So it's not macular degeneration is sort of the poster child because there's a scar in the center of retina. But that feature exists in many other retinal diseases, even in children. So you can have macular degeneration in children. And so cell therapy for us is going to be for those conditions, or sometimes the cells can also be used to deliver a treatment, to deliver a drug. And that's also being explored at the very early stages.
Now, have you treated some children with some of the early treatments?
We have not treated with cell therapy, but we've treated with gene therapy, with gene replacement therapy, where a cause of vision loss, for example, retinitis pigmentosa, is due to a missing gene. So there's a missing function. So if it's like a missing syllable in a sentence, so then the sentence makes no sense and there's no product at the end. So if you can replace the missing gene and reinstate function, then the machinery can start working again. And we've been doing this publicly funded for nearly a year at the Hospital for Sick Children in Sunnybrook, where there's a cause of vision loss due to a defect in the RP65 gene. And I tell you, it's been life-changing for the patients, for the families, and for us as physicians, because we don't often have the privilege of offering something that really makes a difference. And seeing kids that have now recovered sight in the dark, usually those children, they have very poor central sight, but they can't see anything when you transition from a bright to a dim environment. They lose everything. So at night, they can't function on their own and so on. And now they're bicycling at night, they're doing Halloween, and the parents don't need to chaperone them everywhere. So it has massive impact on their confidence and how the adolescents and young adults just pursue their journey with enthusiasm. It's been really an incredible story.
How do you feel when you see that?
It's like we cried the first time, like the whole team, like we just cried with the family. And every case that we do, I get the goosebumps. I get the goosebumps just talking about it. And I think it's a wonderful progression of medicine. It's a new era of medicine. You mentioned it's on the doorstep, and I like that sentence, but for us, it's in the house. So the discussions have to change. The discussions have to change in terms of risk benefits because they're interventions. And in terms of expectations, they're not cures, they're treatments. And that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah. When we talk about it, how do you deliver it? What are the mechanics of it, as simply as you can put it?
For the current gene therapy, it's an intraocular procedure. So the patient needs to be put to sleep. And there's some trocars that are put in the eye. And so some long needles penetrate the eyeball to reach the retina, which is the tissue in the back of the eye that senses the light. And the medication is injected under the retina, hoping that enough healthy cells are going to gobble the medication to restart the vision cycle. And usually you see an effect as early as 2 weeks, and a significant effect at 1 month.
That's
quite-
amazing.
It is.
That's amazing. You mentioned to me when we were preparing for this that some of the kids actually become naughty because they no
Yes.
longer need their parents to shepherd them at night. So
It's very interesting. The behavior of, I'd say, children, adolescents, and adults all change because they become more confident. And often children are sheltered more than others if they didn't have a visual impairment. And now that they don't need that, it's a bit the free-for-all. And so we tell the parents, now is the time to intervene. It's very interesting, the effect on everyone's personalities.
yeah. So are there challenges for you to get these therapies to your kids?
Yes. For us in ophthalmology, the biggest challenge is that very few people are aware of the prevalence of vision loss and the impact that it has on people. And even what it costs to society. A study was done recently where just looking at inherited retinal degeneration, not including age-related macular degeneration and glaucoma, the cost to Canadian taxpayers is $2 to $6 billion a year. And so it's not insignificant, but you don't see someone who's visually impaired, right? That it's a big socioeconomical problem. So for us is to raise awareness, and we try to tell the patients to be vocal about their disability. And so that's also a big culture change that has to happen, and educate the government and authorities, regulatory agencies about the importance of vision loss. So for us, that's been the major barrier.
All right. So I know we're starting to get questions come in, but we'll address those a little bit later. Thank you so much, Dr. Vaillant.
You're welcome.
So now we're going to go to Hamilton and Dr. Foley, where we're going to talk about the therapies, the cell therapies being used with cancer. And you are dealing with CAR-T therapy. So I would just want to say that CAR-T stands for chimeric antigen receptor T cells, but CAR-T is much easier, isn't it, to say? Yeah. When did you start using it? Do you remember your first patient?
Yeah, that's a great question, Avis. It was 2017 that we first embarked on CAR T cell therapy in the context of a clinical trial. We were one of 2 centers in Canada that first started this. So it was obviously extremely exciting and really had beat expectations from when,
And this
when
was
we started.
This was in patients with leukemia who had failed all other treatments. Nothing
Yes.
for them. Nothing
These
for
were-
them.
These were patients with lymphoma and leukemia who really had reached the end of hope, and very little treatment options left in the time they had remaining. So this CAR T came into the scene in that context and started to cure people. And
Did you say cure? Did you say cure?
Well,
You used the C word, yeah?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is that, and obviously I choose that word carefully. But you can imagine, we make a lot of advances in science. The war on cancer goes on every day in many ways. But just like you said, Avis, when you start talking about cure, and remember that's a one and done therapy, they don't need any more treatments, life goes back to normal. That is a remarkable thing.
Mhm.
When you see that, people take notice. And so that's really been a draw to this type of therapy, are the results.
You mentioned one patient that you had treated 7 years ago. So I guess he was in that first cohort, and you were looking for him and you were worried because you couldn't find him.
Yeah, no, this poor gentleman had a terrible journey heading into it. Lots of toxic high dose chemotherapy, deconditioned, things not working, failure after failure. And he entered into the trial. He received a single injection of CAR T cells. By 1 month, he was in complete remission. And just like you said, I was looking for him sometime in the summer, a few years later, and I couldn't track him down. And I was terrified that something bad had happened to him because we were constantly watching these people down the road. But it turned out he was at his cottage water skiing. So it made me realize these people do go back to a quality of life.
How does that make you feel? Cancer is a very hard one to practice medicine in.
Well, I think as part of a research world and a clinical world. Obviously, this is the dawn of a new era, and I think we're all very proud. Look, people didn't stumble onto this. This is the result of decades of well-designed experimental research in preclinical models, initially by just a few groups, but now there's thousands of groups that are working on this. The genie is truly out of the bottle now, and so there's just a lot happening in this area. It's a beautiful system because as you know, Avis, it creates a living drug. So it is a treatment that uses lymphocytes, which are very powerful parts of our immune system. They have this incredible ability to fight infections. They can expand, they can attack, and they can persist. And that's what gets exploited in the CAR T cell therapy. The gene therapy part of it is to create a novel synthetic receptor that specifically targets a target on a cancer cell. And that CAR T cell doesn't care what that cell is. If it has the target, it will go after it. The cells expand in the body. They're like human incubators, creating these armies of cells that go on and on and on. And the folks down in Philadelphia, where a lot of this science came from, talk about cells being there a decade later. So it is a living drug. It's a one and done situation. When it works, it works. And I will say it doesn't work in everybody.
It doesn't. So what are you seeing in your clinic? How many have you treated and what's been the outcome?
We've treated over 100 patients now. And the outcomes are about 40% of people go into remission and stay in remission.
40. And the other ones, can you give it to them again?
Not at present. In some scenarios, kids with leukemia, that's been talked about, but that's experimental. At this stage, we can't give a second dose. But you bring up an extremely important part of this. And look, there's a lot of research going on, a lot of real world research going on to make this better, to improve things, and understanding why it fails maybe as important as understanding why it works, just like you said.
So the question would be, is there a bigger potential if you use it not when everything else has failed, but earlier in the process? Is that possible?
Without question,
yeah.
Without question, the field is moving in that direction. So it's very compelling to think that earlier in the disease, the lymphocytes are in better shape, they're fitter, they haven't been exposed to multiple rounds of other therapies. And, the jaw-dropping part of this is this could work in people who literally were at the end of the line for treatments. And it really miraculous. So huge potential. The field is expanding rapidly. And there's a lot of pressures on how do we caretake this exciting, expensive, but huge hope.
Are you getting requests from patients? Are they starting to ask for it, or do you have the same issue as Dr. Aon that people don't yet know about it?
Well, it's coming along, and there has been sort of an education throughout the nation from healthcare workers and patients and families, and certainly on the internet. So for sure that is building. Patients are becoming a lot more educated. Understanding the patient journey in this situation, though, is quite a remarkable thing, because you just have somebody who's been, really making their final plans, and then all of a sudden, this comes along and everything's changed. So. Look, it's not an easy journey. I wouldn't say that. It's a long staircase, but when it works, it works.
One last question for those who don't know about CAR T: how simply is it applied? What does the patient have to do in order to receive it? How long are they in hospital, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, it's collecting lymphocytes from any patient. We do that with a procedure called leukapheresis. It's a bit like dialysis, but we collect billions of white blood cells, and then the cells are shipped off to a laboratory outside of the institution, often in the States, where the manufacturing happens and the gene transfer happens on those cells to put in this novel kind of synthetic receptor that's very potent at recognizing the cancer cells. The cells come back after about 3 weeks, and the patient receives some chemotherapy to make room for these new cells, and the cells are infused over about 15 minutes and then goes on from there.
They go home. It's
So they stay in hospital.
for a
So
bed.
the
Yeah.
the side effects from an immune system, if it gets too powerful, the immune system is such a powerful thing. If it gets out of control and the chain reaction goes too quickly, patients can become sick, even have to go to the ICU.
Okay. So it has to be done carefully.
It has to
This
be
is
done.
not magical. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And the teams, the cell therapy centers that are performing CAR T have gone through an extensive multidisciplinary setting of the table so that there's education and all the pieces are in place so that there can be no mistakes. The stakes are very high with this, and preparing a cell therapy center is a big part of it.
My last question for now is how many centers in Canada are equipped to do CAR T therapy?
About 13.
13. In all provinces, or is it centered mostly in the bigger centers?
It's often centered in places that are doing other types of stem cell transplants
Okay.
that have the infrastructure for that. But I think part of it, increasing capacity, is looking at other ways to provide this care safely in more centers.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Foley. So now over to Toronto, Dr. Bell. You're listening to the two frontline doctors say what they're seeing. I see you nodding. What do you think with what you're hearing and what you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Avis. Thanks for the invitation to come and chat today about this incredibly exciting new area of therapy. Canadians have several assets that actually contribute to the opportunity to get access to these new therapies that are so important for people who need them. And probably the most important asset is, of course, the people like Dr. Aon, Dr. Foley, internationally recognized experts in current therapies who have connections, who have their own laboratories where new therapies are being explored, and international connections that allow Canadians to get access. And I'm thinking probably the best example that I remember from the time when I was deputy minister in Ontario, had that privilege, was back about 2016 when the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia was starting to treat children with relapsed leukemia with CAR T therapies. These were experimental therapies, and physicians at the Hospital for Sick Children, hematologists, knew the results, these early results from clinical trials that were happening, and wanted their patients who had failed remission, failed bone marrow therapy, for bone marrow transplant therapy, to get access to this treatment. And they asked the Ministry of Health in Ontario to refer people out of country to Philadelphia, and legislation in most provinces prevents us from funding patients to get experimental therapies, as this was characterized at the time, out of country. But the flexibility, because of the expertise present at the Hospital for Sick Children, we were able to actually fund the Hospital for Sick Children from the Ministry of Health to develop a collaborative approach that used the laboratory transformation of cells, lymphocytes, as Dr. Foley explained so well, to undergo therapy. They made a trip to Philadelphia and then returned to follow-up therapy at sick kids. So most of the treatment was in Toronto, funded by the ministry for this new evolving treatment. But the flexibility that was possible for these children who needed this treatment so desperately was because of the international expertise present at sick kids, as there is one of the reasons that CAR T was offered so early at McMaster in Hamilton. The Juravinski Cancer Center was the expertise that Dr. Foley and his colleagues offered that allowed them to get accreditation to provide this treatment. So that's certainly our biggest asset across the country, are the passionately committed clinicians, and basic scientists who've been working on cell therapy for some time. So that's a huge asset for us.
Right. So is that process, though, that you had to go through to get these kids treated sustainable? Or are we looking now
No,
at
it's
having
not.
to create a nice smooth runway? Because these are coming. This is not optional medication or an approach, is it?
You're absolutely right, Avis, and I'm happy to say another asset that we can refer to is CADTH, the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Therapies in Health, which has been preparing for this from 2016, 2017. Their first reviews of regulatory processes for cell and gene therapy have been developing since that time. They've been writing about it. The CEO of CADTH, Suzanne McGurn, who started off working on the provincial side, is well aware of the complexities of federal and provincial regulation, not just to pharmacare. You know, it's a drug agency, a health technology assessment of drugs, but also importantly, therapies in health. And that's probably the best way to characterize cell and gene therapies, is not just as drugs, although drugs are involved, but therapies that are complex and that involve, you know, different parts of the healthcare system. So you mentioned the new CRISPR therapies of genetically altered cells being reinfused in people who have thalassemia or have sickle cell disease. Well, treatment for these children and adults is pretty well organized in our Canadian healthcare system. So if we look at the situation in Toronto, for example, there are hemoglobinopathy clinics, that is, clinics for children and adults who have altered hemoglobin, sickle cell or thalassemia hemoglobin, at sick kids, and across the street at the Toronto General, who've been treating children with these illnesses. And of course, they're linked to the hematology centers at Princess Margaret and at Sick Kids, who are actually providing bone marrow transplant therapy. And it's sort of similar, the CRISPR therapies, to bone marrow transplant therapies, as Dr. Foley mentioned. So we're pretty well organized in terms of introduction of these complex diseases, or introduction of these complex therapies, because we have a history of treating people in expert centers like I just described.
I think I hear a but coming. But
well, you know, the issue of how do we organize our complex federal, provincial, territorial health system into something that deals in a straightforward, as you say, smooth pipeline for introducing these new therapies is tricky. For example, you asked, you know, how many centers will provide this therapy across Canada? And Dr. Foley mentioned 13 centers for CAR T therapy. If we look at centers that may be introducing CRISPR therapies for hemoglobinopathies or new genetic therapies for other diseases, hemophilia, for example, probably there'll only be 2 centers for these early hemoglobin diseases, or treating hemoglobinopathy diseases, 1 in children perhaps, and 2 in adults. So how do we get patients to the centers that are capable of providing them with care? And crucially, how do we decide on what's a fair price? That pharmaceutical companies have worked for years, they've invested billions of dollars in research. How do we ensure that they're getting a fair price for the treatments that they're providing? And that's the one place I'll mention a big but, is that Canada is one of the few Western countries that does not yet have a strategy for teaching or treating rare diseases, nor do we have a strategy for how we're going to pay for drugs for rare diseases. And many of these new genetic cell therapies will be characterized as rare diseases when they start up. And how do we figure out, is $1 million for treating a patient with sickle cell disease? I can tell you, as an orthopedic surgeon, forget about the cost. If you've treated 1 patient with a joint crisis from sickle cell disease, you know, whatever the cost, this is going to be worthwhile. But how do we look at a fair cost? And that question is complex, and it requires complex negotiations. And that's going to be one of the things that people whose kids who want themselves to have access to this therapy are going to be pushing for. How do we get these rare diseases into our system? How do we get treatments for these rare diseases into our system with fair access quickly?
What's your assessment of where Canada stands compared to other countries?
I think it's hard to say across a broad spectrum of illnesses. I mean, as Dr. Foley's described, McMaster Chervinsky Cancer Center started treating patients with relapse lymphoma with CAR T at a fairly early stage of the progression and introduction of these treatments. I think that we have a real challenge in that we don't even know how to characterize what a rare disease is in this country. We definitely need to improve access through doing under the new pharmacare policy that's being introduced just last week. We need to reinvigorate the discussion about rare diseases, how we invest in, how we provide contingent pricing examples. For example, if a patient is cured of sickle cell disease, well, there are hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, of saving for the healthcare system. So if it is indeed, as Dr. Foley said, one and done, all those costs are being avoided. On the other hand, if 10 years from now the therapy stops working, was it fair to have paid for a one and done therapy? So the idea of contingency in what the real world effects are, what the real world evidence of impact is something that's important that we haven't started to talk about in negotiations with how we gain access to these drugs and other therapies.
So what is the motivation then that can come to make the discussion happen? Because as you mentioned, one of the interesting points about the one and done, if it doesn't work, I've heard that some jurisdictions are looking at getting their money back if it doesn't.
So that's the idea of contingent pricing, is that
okay.
So they contingent upon the real world evidence of what happens. And this is something that's also a challenge in Canada in that we have 13 provincial territorial health systems. Where do we get the evidence from each health system to ensure that the real world outcomes that we're seeing for patients are being achieved? And how do we relate that to the payment that we're willing to provide for these brilliant and revolutionary therapies? So these are questions that we have to challenge. The CADTH, as mentioned, is certainly providing us with a lot of information in terms of health technology assessment of what this could be and advice around the issue of contingent pricing based on real world evidence. But we really have to get our act together as a nation in terms of the way we gather information from 13 different health systems and bring it together in a single understanding of what accomplishments are being achieved for patients, in understanding what we're willing to pay as a single national price for a medication.
That's a big one. One last question before we leave you at this point, but who should take the lead, or how do provinces and hospitals, where does the initiative begin to push it forward?
So we're fortunate in that CADTH, the Canadian Canadian Agency for Drug Therapies and Health Assessment, is a single agency that gives us information about the international evidence for how things work and advice regarding how they should be paid for. We then have another pan-Canadian organization called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, PCPA, that takes that CADTH evidence or advice and creates a negotiating policy with the companies that are introducing these. And that is a real economic business negotiation. With these new therapies, that's where into the business negotiation needs to be inserted the real world evidence of what the outcomes are from these new treatments. And they're being introduced at a stage when they've only been around for 2 or 3 years, perhaps. Yeah. And what do we say if they're having a huge impact at 4 or 5 years, or if they're failing to have the same impact that's expected? So these are complex discussions. We do have pan-Canadian structures, CADTH and PCPA, that take the lead on this, and that's good for us. That is good.
Good. All right. Thanks, Dr. Bell. Back to you, Dr. Aon. Let's talk a little bit about your struggles, because I know that you've had the good outcomes, but it's taken a lot of work for you to get the okay to use these. Can you explain how much work it's taking and where we should go, or any advice you have for people listening
yes.
in, where to
Yeah,
go?
thank you. And I'd like to follow up on Dr. Bell's comment on the word outcome. And so this is a new era of medicine, and choosing the right outcome to link to the pricing is something anyway in our field that we're just learning about. And it's important to say, what is the most critical outcome measure of change that's significant for the patient, you would like to think, rather than for the regulatory agency? And that's an evolving field. So from my perspective, the Luxturna, the drug that we're talking about, was approved in the United States in 2017, in Europe in 2018, Health Canada in 2020, the provinces in 2022, in reimbursement only in April of 2023. And this was extremely frustrating because these are progressive forms of vision loss. And by the time reimbursement was approved, some patients were no longer eligible because there weren't enough viable cells. Now, the Health Canada approval, in part, was delayed by the company. And we have a reputation, and Dr. Bell can correct me if I'm wrong, but that companies don't like to apply to Health Canada because they say we're complicated. And we have new drugs in the pipeline, and I'm like, no, apply to Health Canada early. And so that's been very frustrating. So we've had to send many documents and calls with Health Canada, and the same we followed with CADIT and INES and the PCPA. And actually, just to figure out on which door to knock on was a major journey. And luckily, I had the support of the institution to navigate this jungle. And in the institution, because of my questions, we've managed to put together a group that didn't know each other, which was interesting. They were all leaders who didn't know each other, but all played a key role in making it happen. So it was a full-time job.
It was, I bet. Do you have any advice for people listening in on what they can do to get health teams and governments to work together to make this a little more, fluid?
I think the together part is the key. And so we were in our expertise was not solicited early. Like, we've had to go and knock on the doors to say, we have this expertise, we have this scenario, and this is a pressing situation. So, and at the institutional level, what helped me was involving the CEO and our administrative VP or executive VPs early, and pharmacy. Pharmacy was an incredible support. But you need to approach this from a team perspective, the budget managers, and we created the national network also, like to involve colleagues.
Can you break it down to a step-by-step, 5 things that people watching this need to do if they want to facilitate this?
Not work in isolation, and identify who are the key stakeholders, identify who has the expertise, like Dr. Bell said, like, who are the experts that you're going to reach out to? That's imperative. And then figure out what's the major hurdle to make it happen. So usually that's cost. So you need to involve the budget people, the pharmacy people, and the hospital people. It's teamwork.
That's the recipe as far as you see it at this point. What would you like to see happen? Top down?
Well, I'd like that people take us seriously. Like, I find that administrators and it's like if the administrators look at us as physicians as whiners, and they would not take our request seriously. And that was a bit frustrating. Like, this drug was approved in Croatia way before it was approved in Canada, and like, all my respect to Croatia, but that was very very frustrating, and visual impairment is a big deal.
Yeah.
And another hurdle that we face is the identification of eligible patients, and that's through access to genetic testing. So we're privileged in Ontario to have an excellent access to genetic testing, though through major centers, but it wasn't the same throughout Canada.
So, Dr. Foley, what are you learning about the system that's needed to get these therapies to more patients? Is there any, what would you like to see in the runway? I don't know how complicated it is for you now that you have an established program, but what do you think needs to happen?
Actually, I just changed my microphone. Can you hear me okay, Avis?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, obviously that's a great question. I think the solution will be a blend of things that we put together and we work on, and maybe just some of the little things summated will help us move along. I would say that the first thing, and you said it early on, is we really need to take stock of what's coming. And Dr. Bell's 100% right. The health technologies in Canada are superb, and they do an amazing job at a very comprehensive review of the values and the success of these treatments. But, are we looking at a lineup down the road and then it turns a corner and you're, the number of treatments coming? I think we need to get a good sense of that so that we can prepare. And with CRISPR-Cas9, it sort of adds to all of that. The second thing I think that we can do as clinicians and through research, especially research in the real world, is become better at selecting the right patients. Can we envision a day where I said, we talked about 40%, but can we get it to a point where we're choosing 100% correct? So that virtually every we've learned things about the system that allow us to get to that point. The other big thing is automation. And, right now it takes, one of the limitations of CAR-T is it takes about 2 months to get your cells, but are there things we can do to improve the automation? For example, they're now looking at making CAR-T cells in 2 days instead of a 12 to 14-day incubation. So all those little things add up. The other thing is, can we create common platforms? In other words, if a certain platform for gene therapy works, can you start taking other treatments and kind of plug and play and also potentially look at costs? So look, the solutions for this are going to come from, a large group of people, including politicians, institutions, pharma, scientists, clinicians. It's going to be a group effort. But I do think that we, bit by bit, as we focus on little things, a blend of solutions is going to come about. And we have to understand who's doing what are the roles. But you're 100% right. You said it from the beginning. We got to face this because this is coming. It's like sipping water from a fire hose. It's coming in a hurry. And, patients' lives are at stake. The stakes are incredibly high, but I'm confident we're going to get it done.
2 quick questions for you, Dr. Foley. What's your hope and what's your worry?
Well, hope is already there. The
treatment is hopeful.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you cure somebody, that's hope with a capital H. I mean, that's the big one. Yeah, it's going to take a village or a town, or it's going to take a lot of bright people with very varying expertise to figure this out. But my hope goes back to I marvel at the science, and it was 1953 when Watson and Crick discovered DNA. A mere 70 years later, we're using this stuff.
It is.
And with successful outcomes. I mean, you just have to marvel in where science has come. And that's, hats off to a lot of very bright basic scientists, including Canadian basic scientists that figured this stuff out. I mean, our role as end users is important so that it's safe. But, man, there's been some incredible discoveries, and that's not going to stop, you know. So
True, true.
I'm very
Um,
hopeful.
I see questions coming in, but I have a few for Dr. Bell before we go there. One of the questions I was asked to pose is there anything that we did during COVID to bring vaccines, these treatments to people quickly that could be used as a template for getting these newer expensive therapies to people?
Yeah, that's a great comment, Avis. First of all, I think we saw that Health Canada has become more nimble in approval of new types of products. The mRNA vaccine products hadn't been used before. They were quite quick in developing approval processes that responded to the urgency of the situation. I think the other thing that Canadians need to recognize is we're a country of 40 million people spread across a massive geography and multiple health systems, as mentioned. We need to have more pan-Canadian, or goodness gracious, call it federal engagement in understanding the pipeline that's coming, in determining, as Dr. Hayan said, the outcomes of patients. If we've got 14 patients across this country being treated with a new therapy, we can't afford to have each health system evaluating the outcomes, reporting them separately. We need to have a pan-Canadian approach to gathering data and integrating data together in a way that allows us to think as a country, not as 13 individual health systems. So that strategy for patients with rare diseases that I mentioned before, I'll mention again, to say that increasingly cancer is not one disease, lymphoma is not one disease, it's multiple diseases based on the genetic challenges posed by the disease. So even fairly common cancers like lymphoma become a set of rare diseases that require separate diagnosis through genomic analysis and separate therapy, depending on what those analyses show us. And that subsegments the population of patients in a way that says we've got to look at this as a population of 40 million people, not as individual provinces and territories. And we have to bring this data together in a more effective way to get the best treatments to people.
That raises the other question about the cost, because we hear a lot in the health system these days, we just don't have the money, or there's money being meted out for health, for emergencies and things like that. And I can hear that, legislators and payers, when they look at one treatment, 3 million, 2 million, that can we afford these, or do you have to show cost benefit before you go further with it? Big issue aside, when you have a single payer, what do? It's hard to swallow some of these numbers.
Well, the so-called pharmacoeconomic analysis, that's a long term, but it is an important term that organizations like CADIF and INES in Quebec provide, are essential, and they're based on our willingness to pay. These aren't the big challenges, though. These aren't the challenges that break the healthcare system. The challenges that break the healthcare system are, how do we manage the increasing population of frail and cognitively impaired seniors? Those are the big cost savers, not how do we treat patients with hemophilia who are going to be cured of a terrible disease, patients with sickle cell who are going to be cured of a terrible disease, and decrease cost to the system thereafter.
That's right. I was reading that just on the thalassemia one, another blood disorder, that 39 of 42 patients who got the gene therapy for that never needed another blood cell transfusion for at least a year. So that's got to be a big saving, right? Yeah.
Your lips to God's ears, Avis. That is a huge savings for, what are we talking about? 40 patients that have been treated so far. I mean, this is a rounding error based on the healthcare costs of what we spend appropriately and what we need to spend more on, which is treating seniors in a more cost-effective way in our system.
Yeah.
So we need to think about cost effectiveness, absolutely. That is the duty of politicians who are elected to look after public funds. And they're absolutely right to say we have to look at cost effectiveness. But we also crucially need political attention to what is our strategy for doing so? How are we looking at the hundreds, if not thousands of new treatments coming? And how are we going to treat small groups of 50 patients across Canada and make sure these people are getting access to the cures they deserve?
Okay, some questions from people who are watching in. I guess this one goes to Dr. Foley. If CAR T fails, does it have an effect on the traditional treatments? And I guess the answer is no, because they've already failed the traditional treatments. Is there anything after CAR T?
There is.
Oh,
So,
do tell. Do tell.
so it's a timely question, Avis, because a lot of new therapies have kind of come into this what we call the third line space for patients, particularly with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which is the one that can be cured. CAR T has the longest sort of track record of seeing the cures because we've been watching them a while. As I said, one fellow 7 years now. But there is a similar sort of immune therapy called a BiTE therapy, and that's quickly emerging into this space as well. Bit of a different mechanism. It's not gene therapy, but so there are other treatments. Specifically to the question, post CAR T, sometimes there's some residual cytopenias and hematologic toxicity that do make subsequent treatments down the road a challenge, but not impossible. Up until just a few years ago, there really was nothing post CAR T, but things are moving into that space.
Another question, I think it would go to you. If someone saved their child's umbilical cord at a private bank, does that fit into the cell therapies or the gene therapy at all?
Wow, that's a great question. So, not at present, not at present. And again, this kind of speaks to, like right now, when we're talking about CAR T, it's a patient's own lymphocytes that we're using. But in an effort to speed up the process for patients, especially for patients who have unstable disease, they are talking about off-shelf CAR Ts and off-shelf NKT cells. So that's not the patient's own one. That's something you can take off the shelf and give it. There would be some additional risks associated with that, graft versus host disease and other immune problems. But in terms of the question, it's a good question. We're not there yet, but it's it's something for potentially down the road.
Dr. Aon, how about this one? How do we loop in the public into all of this discussion? And can you use patient partner community to help? You kind of suggested you're already trying that. And who should lead that public awareness? Is it disease per disease or? Did we lose your audio?
I think Elise is muted.
Sorry.
You're muted, yeah.
Sorry, Avis. Yes.
Go
So
ahead.
we've been discussing this with Novartis, who's the company who distributes the current gene therapy, in that there needs to be education of the public, but also of various level of eye care providers to optimize patient access. Like in rare diseases of the eye, some people don't even realize that you can do genetic testing and identify the precise genetic cause, which plays a key role in the management of patients. So there's room for education, as the person said, using patients, but also various level of eye care providers to raise the level of awareness. That's very important.
Is okay. One of the other questions is if we were to develop more of these technologies, because they are labor intensive, some of them, and create more Canadian made cell and gene therapies, would that help? And is there enough being done? I did see that there was one program set up by one of the agencies in Ottawa to promote this. Are we doing enough to get Canadian-made products and therapies?
I don't know about the others, but I don't think it being Canadian-made is the hurdle right now, in part because we're talking of rare diseases. So I'm sure Dr. Foley, like me, we're part of an international community and the clinical trials are international. The limiting factor in this being accepted more broadly is the cost, as was mentioned. And if, for example, in Canada, I did realize we don't have our own GMP facility, like to make the drugs. And if that was made in Canada, the cost could be much cheaper. That's the big hurdle right now. But I think that the invention doesn't necessarily need to be made here. There's not enough money in the system for that.
So we're reliant on whatever's happening elsewhere in the world, really.
Or here.
Or here.
Like
there's some here.
The research funding here is very limited compared to, for example, the United States. And it's very costly to develop such treatments, like even Luxturna, even to make it, before making it to the phase 3, the few centers who involved, it must have been at least $40 million before a phase 3 trial. It's very, very expensive.
Hence the big price tag. I think this question would go to you, Dr. Bell, and you've kind of touched on it, but if we don't have enough time or evidence yet for real world data, won't we have to make decisions on these medications or these therapies without evidence? In that case, how do you make the decision?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I'll go back to what Dr. Aon mentioned earlier, and that is patient outcomes. What's important for patients? Because we're willing to pay a lot of money for things that transform lives. I mean, that's been demonstrated in the discussions that we've had here today. The question is, do products transform lives? Are they, as Dr. Foley mentioned, one and done? These are things that can only be understood with real world evidence. We're not great in Canada at collecting pan-Canadian real world evidence. We need to be much better at that. And organizations like CADIS that totally understand this, organizations like Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which totally understand this, need to engage in discussions about costing and revenue to pharmaceutical companies based on this real world outcome. That's outcome that's important to patients. If they achieve that, full marks, full funding. If they don't achieve that, or if there's slippage and relapse in the outcomes that are important, then perhaps the original price that was negotiated gets rebated in some way. There are lots of ways of approaching this, but I agree with whoever the questioner was that said, should we wait to have real world evidence that we can rely on? That's not necessary. We can do this conditional or contingent approach to pharmaceutical pricing.
Fantastic. Well, I guess we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you to those who've asked for questions, and thank you to all of you. I really hope that those listening in and watching have a real good sense of the excitement around these and why this issue has to be looked at, because patients and doctors will be asking for it once they hear about it. So regardless of what happens, this will be a topic. And I just want to thank everyone and pass it over to Matt.
Thank you, Avis. And again, just to reiterate with what Avis just said, thank you to everybody. Thank you to all our speakers and Avis for running the show today. And thank you for everybody joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. And that's it. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.